sympathy. This is the first poster that was done for the film, considered way too avant-garde by the distributor that picked it up. They're like, what is that weird mummy picture? And so this is the poster that they ended up going with, which picked up on the themes of phrenology and the rest of it. I found it sort of interesting, the notion of just marketing the rest of it. This was considered way too strange of a poster to sell a movie, that this somehow was considered an acceptable poster to sell a film. The notion of marketing and sort of afterlife of film. So that's the skills I want to show you. See if we can make this work again. We can. Yay, we are at the top of the lights. I think what I want to do is show a few short scenes from the film and comment from there. Let me switch to video. There's one small thing I want to show you now that I'm going to show this afternoon in order to how to access something. You may or may not be aware that on some DVDs there are so-called Easter eggs. Have you all ever heard of an Easter egg before? Easter eggs are basically hidden extras on the DVD, which means that there's a hidden movie or hidden material on the DVD for whatever reason is there, and you have to know how to get to it. So there is hidden material on Swoon. And there's a short film I made called Jeffrey Bean 30, which is about 35-minute long fashion film that I made, commissioned by Jeffrey Bean after I made Swoon. It's a sort of very peculiar film. I'll show either all of it or some of it this afternoon, depending on how time works out. But I want to show you, if you're interested, how to access the film, because it's on the Swoon DVD. So you go to the True Crime Photo. This is available on the Swoon DVD in the United States, which is released by Strand Releasing. Basically, you have to get the one from the U.S. that's in Strand Releasing. You can order directly from Strand. It's easily achievable. So you go to True Crime Photo Gallery. You select it. That's the real Nathan Lear prison passport. And then you take a prison photograph, you take the last two numbers, 0, 6, you press 0 and 6. And you may have to shoot enter, you should know, there you go. And the secret movie happens, and I'm not going to show it now. I'll come back to this one later today. So, just wanted to show you how you access the extra. And this is when this comes up later today. If you want to find it, you can. Main menu. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, again, show just a number of scenes and talk a little bit about them.
Dick threw a brick through the Paulson drugstore window. June 21st, 1923. Train ride to the Lowe's summer cottage. Private compartment. September 9th, 1923. We burned a building near the train station. We watched the fireman extinguish it. October 13th, 1923. I've waited 6 weeks since our last crime. He's letting me down again.
I think there are a number of things that are interesting to think about at the beginning of the sequence of the film. First of all, I think it's just a kind of, I'm trying to establish really right away this kind of highly romantic mise-en-scène of the film and trying to create this sort of, although they were brutal murderers and committed this really crime, this terrible crime, that within their consciousness it was a kind of act of beauty and a kind of bonding between them. And this is really getting at sort of what I talked a little bit yesterday, that's a core within my work of this idea of a kind of elegant surface with a kind of brutality underneath it and a kind of juxtaposition of those two things. This obviously, the Leopold Loeb case has been, or maybe you don't know it, but has been quite heavily dictated upon for many years in terms of cinematic history, going back first to Alfred Hitchcock's film called Rope, which is basically a kind of loosely, thinly veiled story of Leopold Loeb, famous probably most of all because it was shot in a long take shooting style. Rope is basically constructed out of 8 long 10-minute shots. Not my favorite Hitchcock film, but a sort of intriguing film that got at this kind of relationship. Never really, only hinted at, never really articulated the kind of sexual relationship between the two of them. Then there's a film called Compulsion, which was based on a novel by Richard Fleischer, written in the late 50s, which was a completely directly lifted out of the court records and all the rest of it, but just changed the names of the characters of Leopold Loeb. Leopold tried to sue Richard Fleischer actually for the novel Compulsion, because he said it's a libelous novel. This is obviously based on me, but he failed in his case. And there was a movie made in the early 1960s, which again hints at, but never really dealt with the idea of the kind of sexual relationship between the two of them. Then there have been a number of contemporary movies, like there's a movie called Murder by Numbers by Barbet Schroeder with Ryan Gosling and Michael Pitt in it, which is obviously very, very closely based upon Leopold Loeb, and even sort of the Michael Haneke movie called Funny Games can be seen to be very heavily influenced by the dynamic of Leopold Loeb. The more contemporary movies that are dealing with these crime stories have tended to tell the story from the perspective of the criminals. Interestingly, both Hitchcock's film and Compulsion told the film from the kind of normative law and order positions. And so, there's a kind of watershed, there are several watershed moments in cinematic history that were very influential in my own thinking. One of them is what I intimated in that little statement I read before, which is the idea of so-called pre-code cinema. Turn the light on because it's a little bizarre talking so far. For those of you who don't know, in 1934 in the United States, in June of 1934, a production code was implemented that governed all of what could be put on screen in America. There's an incredible history of cinema of sound cinema before 1934, particularly from 30 to 34, in which the representation specifically of women is quite remarkable. Women have sex outside of marriage, they have abortions, they're completely unrepentant about their kind of adult, sophisticated, erotic lives in these movies up to 1934, and the Catholic Legion of Decency rallied. There was a kind of grassroots Catholic movement all across the United States of America through the 1930s that led to this agreement with the studios in 1934 to restrict what could be on screen. So all kind of things change after that period of time. Prior to 34, from 30 to 34, you'd often see the protagonist of the film be a criminal. You'd be asked to have kind of empathy for criminal characters. And after that period of time, there was a whole incredibly elaborate censorship guideline that restricted what could be put on film. In the late 1950s and early 60s, the production code started to erode. There are a number of directors like Otto Preminger and others who worked against the production code quite openly. And by the time you get to the early 60s and the mid-60s, the code starts to fall down. A movie like Bonnie and Clyde, which was released in 1967, really is sort of the final nail in the coffin of the production code. And Bonnie and Clyde, I think, is a very interesting movie to look at because it's one of the first movies for many years within American culture where a criminal story is told from the perspective of within the criminal relationship, not from the perspective of the judge or the trial attorney. You were asked to identify with these characters. And if you look at Bonnie and Clyde is very clearly a movie about the 60s and about the counterculture. They were countercultural heroes. People saw Bonnie and Clyde as a kind of corollary of what was going on in the Vietnam War and kind of social resistance of the time. And I was very intrigued. And as a young person, I saw Bonnie and Clyde and didn't really understand what was below the surface of the film. I was just excited by the kind of romantic relationship between Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, and sort of intrigued by the story of the material. But then when I did more research and thought about it, I really understood that it was a kind of coded commentary on the present day. And this notion that you could use the past to talk about the present was incredibly powerful in my own thinking about how I was going to work cinematically. Swoon was absolutely a commentary, not only on kind of the homophobic atmosphere of what I grew up into in the 1980s and the rest of it, but in a very complicated way, something I'm kind of uncomfortable being pinned down around. But there is some element of the kind of fear, terror, and social upheaval of AIDS that actually strongly informed the desire to make Swoon, and somehow is within Swoon on a kind of deeply buried unconscious level. This idea that you could find a way to take a story, it was a kind of very transformative moment in my own work, that you could find a story that was not about your own experience. I never murdered a 14-year-old child. I have no interest in doing so. I mean, the odd part, probably spending a couple days with me, you're starting to get a sense of I'm a relatively light-hearted, humorous person that makes incredibly dark, tortured work, which is a kind of a slightly mystery to me. And I was like, why the heck do I make this work? Because I'm actually kind of a cheerful, well-adjusted person. And it was this kind of corollary, a way to express things of my own experience that I was too afraid to deal with directly. So I'm not particularly interested or able to make autobiographical work, although I would say that all of my work is incredibly deeply personal. And that much of what you see in the film and sort of the translation of moments of behavior, that's how I enter these kind of identifying with characters that are outside my own experience, is trying to find the humanity within them, the points of commonality within them, and look at things that correspond with my own experience and how I can translate them through this other narrative. I think making autobiographical narrative fiction films is fantastic. It's just not something that I have a great strength in. This approach has gotten me into trouble. Like with my family, got me into total trouble when I made Savage Grace, because they were like, "What does that mean?" And I was like, "I didn't ever want to sleep with Mom. Don't worry about it." But I could talk about I could talk about some of the kind of behavioral and psychological tensions within the case of my own access to that. In some ways, my attraction, I think, to working with these kind of stories that are really, really transgressive, maybe is corollary to what an actor does, because actors often speak about the kind of transformative experience of being able to play, a surgeon, a violinist, a murderer, all these different kind of experiences that their normal life would never allow them to do. There's this kind of great transformation of your own autobiography. You submerge yourself into the identity of these other characters. And as a director, there's something kind of very cathartic about allowing my feared, unconscious drives to kind of come alive and be on a film and acting out things that in my real life I could never imagine acting out. And it's something that at the time I made Swoon, I don't really believe I was unconscious of. It was very driven kind of instinctively by making the film. It's something, as I've looked back and sort of understood my work a bit more, that the motor of it really is this kind of transformative notion of taking the personal and hiding it in a way within something that has nothing to do with my own autobiographical life.
When did you make it? What year?
Swoon was made in I shot it shot in 14 shooting days, which is insane when I think about it. We shot for 10 days in 1990. We stopped shooting for 8 months because we ran out of money. And I had shot so many scenes against white walls and, so simply. Then I raised a bit more money and we came back and also we shaved Leopold's head in the prison scene, so I could no longer go back and shoot anything. So I waited 8 months for the actor's hair to grow back out, and then shot the scene, and went back and shot for 4 additional days. It's sort of remarkable when I think now that we shot a feature in 14 shooting days. The movie it's also sort of stunning when you think of the cost of the film. The film was shot in regular 16mm, not Super 16, not 35. So this glorious, gorgeous-looking movie was shot in just regular black and white 16mm film, and to get the movie entirely in the can, all 14 shooting days, is about $48,000. Was the entire budget of the film. The final budget of Swoon is about $250,000, and that's because When I made the film, I never expected it to be theatrically released. It's sort of funny to think of this now, but there was a period of time in the late 80s and early 90s where you could actually make 16mm work and release it in sort of on the college circuit and this kind of independent film circuit that still was quite vital during that period of time. So I never thought it never occurred to me I would make a theatrically released feature film that Fine Line, New Line would release. When we finished the film, and it came out very sort of classical looking, and people were like, oh wow, you have ability as a narrative director. The film ended up being sold to New Line, which required us to blow it up to 35mm. That's where the $200,000 came in. We spent about $150,000 to blow up from 16mm to 35mm, and then to finish the sound work and the rest of it. So I'm going to show just a teeny bit more of the film. Moving forward, where is that?
16th night.
Oh, there's one more thing about Carl before you can see the live. The last thing I'm going to comment on, and you can see why I show the research material first. One of the things I really struggled with, in the early 90s, the kind of low-budget independent film, seeing one of our mantras was the idea of the budget is the aesthetic. The idea that when you're making a low-budget film, instead of trying to hide what you cannot spend, you put it dead center in the film. So the strategy in Swoon was, I can afford to shoot an extreme close-up of the tabletop because I can rent the tablecloth, the glasses, and the cigarette lighter. But I cannot rent the lamp because it's too expensive. So I made a whole film style out of the use of punctuating extreme close-ups and made it seem intentional. It made it seem like I wanted to show these kind of fragmented details of the film, not that I couldn't afford to. Or similarly, I could only rent one period car in the film. This is the period car that we had for 2 days. The way I solved the problem of opening up the canvas of the film or making the film larger was integrating within the film archival footage. So that little montage you saw in the diary section weaves together black and white archival footage from the 20s. An incredible resource for archival footage, for those of you who don't know about it, is the National Archive in Washington. The National Archive in Washington has a fairly good online database, but the best way to work with it is actually to go to the National Archive in Washington. The reason why you want to work with the National Archive in Washington is everything they own in their archives is in the public domain. So that means you can make, and there are filmmakers, so-called found, archival or found filmmakers, who make entire, like Bruce Conner and other experimental filmmakers, whose whole body of work is out of using appropriated found footage. And in order to work that way, it'd be extremely expensive if you had to license all that footage, because usually archival footage is quite expensive. You have to pay per minute. There are a few pieces of film in Swoon that I had to pay. I bought from Fox Movietone, because I couldn't find them in the National Archive, certain very specific images. And so you have a point of reference. The Fox Movietone material I bought cost $350 a minute to license. Plus it cost another $400 a minute to transfer from the original 35mm to a new copy. And because it was shot in 1920s on nitrate negative, in the 20s nitrate negative was the original negative, it was not only flammable and explosive, you had to literally insure it to ship it through FedEx because a spark will make the thing leap into flames. And on top of that, it shrunk down. So the size of a normal 35 gauge, it's like 5% smaller, so it has to be manually copied because it doesn't register on a rank. You can't fit the sprocket holes on a rank. So, the Fox Movietone material in the movie ended up costing like $1,500 or $1,700 a minute when everything was said and done. And the material from the National Archive cost about $45 a minute. Because you could just, I took material, I had to pay no lights, and you can blow it up. It's quite an incredible resource. They have educational, military films, all kinds of films dating from the chief bulk of their materials runs from the 30s to the 60s. They don't have much in the 20s, they have some stuff. And they have an extraordinarily healthy amount of stuff. The way that you generally work at the National Archive is to work by categories. So you do like circus acrobats, and you do a card catalog search, and they'll come up with all the clips that have circus acrobats, and then you either hire a researcher who transfers the material for you in Washington, or what I did is took several train trips there and worked. There's another filmmaker who's Swoon became known as one of the sort of films that developed the so-called movement, which most of the members of the movement sort of rejected the title, which was called New Queer Cinema. I'm sort of always dubious about the notion of new any cinema. We have the new black cinema, we have new women cinema, we have new Asian cinema. And this idea of sort of branding a kind of cinematic movement is often the kind of domain of marketers and critics. It's not sort of really organic characterization of the film. In some cases, with some of the filmmakers in the new queer cinema, like Todd Haynes, who's a very close friend of mine and a sometime collaborator, we were close. There was a connection with other filmmakers, not so much necessarily. But there is another filmmaker named Christopher Munch, who's probably the least known of the so-called new queer cinema directors. It's M-U-N-C-H. He made an incredible film called The Hours and the Times, which actually, when Swoon went to Berlin, I won the Caligari Prize in the Berlin Forum, and he won the top prize in the Forum that year for a film called The Hours and the Times, which is a heartbreakingly beautiful story about a kind of imagined story about Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, who goes to a hotel in Spain and spends a weekend there. Sort of beautifully handled, low-budget film that managed to cast John Lennon and Brian Epstein and really pull off with great authority and kind of great lyricism with this window of Brian Epstein's life. Later, he made a film called it's got an insane title. It's called The Color of a Brisk and Leaping Day. It won cinematography in Sundance probably like 98 or something. Michael Stipe is an actor in the film. And it's a film about the building of the railroads in the West in the late 19th century. And he used all kinds of strategies of incorporating archival footage or doing map photography using sort of old-fashioned techniques that I thought was really quite remarkable in the film. Yeah.
I just wanted a little elaboration with the stock footage things. I think that's very interesting. So do they actually, they have like all this negative lying around and then they're like, all right, you can borrow it and you take it to a lab and they...
How they duplicate now, you'd have to check with them. Basically, in fact, yes, they do. There is a huge, refrigerated, well-stored master negative of all the source material in 35, 16, and some Super 8. They have some prints, but mostly have the master negative. Then that negative has been transferred, usually mostly very low-budget transfer, to a video source so that you can catalog and look at the source. It's got an edge code or key code on it so that you can identify exact material you want. You look at the material, you identify the exact handles of the material you want, the cut point in and out, and then they transfer. At the time I did it, the National Archives stipulated a lab. You had to use a lab they used, which was, I have to say, not ideal because in some cases I had to do things 2 or 3 times to get the copy correct. And obviously if you're working from original negative, if it's 35mm negative, you make 35mm negative, you make a 35mm IP in interpositive, and from that interpositive, you strike a new negative. In film, each time you make a generation, so you go from the original neg to IP, and then back to 35mm negative again, you increase the contrast in the grain structure. So you've got to be really careful. If you've got really grainy source material to start with, the material can get very messy. They have some video material. And the print material they have, you would order, if they have 35mm that exists as a print and not as a negative, they would strike a negative from it. And you get, in other words, they would make a reversal of the print, and you'd end up with negative material.
And then just as a continuation of that, have you ever colorized footage?
I never have, but I'm very interested this afternoon and maybe segging into tomorrow morning. It depends how time flows out in terms of what I want to present. I'm going to show a little bit of sort of this early avant-garde work from the American 20th century, much of which dealt with hand tinting and dye transfer materials, where they literally, like if you look at the early Méliès and early other filmmakers, they went frame by frame and painted on top of the material. I've never done it. I've started to do in the Super 8 work. I just showed a little bit of that Super 8 work last night. I'm starting to do work where I'm manipulating. I assume you guys know, if you're not filmmakers in terms of working with film, there's 2 types of film. There's reversal film, which when you expose the film ends up being positive. So it is instantly projectable. Super 8 is a reversal film. You shoot the film, and when you process the film, you get back a positive image that can be run through a projector. Most professional, quote-unquote, professional film is negative. So Swoon was shot on 16mm negative film, which means when you get it back from the lab, it's a negative image, and in order to project it, you either transfer it from the negative to video to get a positive image, or you make a so-called work print. You go to positive material. If you're working with reversal material, you can scratch the emulsion. The emulsion is actually the silver that's coated on the plastic. So right now I've been just beginning to work with using dental tools, very fine needles, and scraping off the emulsion part of the image. So like obliterating part of the image. If someone's walking and I like erase one of their legs or something like that by scratching the emulsion off in that section. I've not really done anything with color. Right now I'm just working with the idea of
Do you know how you would colorize something? Or?
You know, you can anything that will adhere to the material. You know, the issue. There's two issues. One is that if you go from film to video, it's much more forgiving. So you know, like I use a transfer place in Boston called Brodsky and Treadway. They are these incredible, crazy hippies, adorable hippie couple that are sort of in their 60s, and they're like the guru of Super 8, and they do immaculate, beautiful work. And you can do anything to the Super 8.
Are they a lab, or are they just...
They are a transfer house. Basically, they don't process film. All they do is take Super 8 film and transfer it to video. They're fairly expensive. I mean, there are places in New York City, like there's a place called PAC Lab in New York City. It's PAC Lab. That's, you know, an inexpensive Super 8 house where you can buy a roll of Super 8 film and process it for like $12 a roll, and then they'll transfer it to video for fairly cheap. I don't know exactly the prices. Brodsky Treadway costs more money because they're extremely meticulous in the process of their transferring of it. And, you know, if you saw the first short I showed yesterday, the kind of immaculate image quality in some of that transfer is the result of their work. I've done a lot of stuff where scraping emulsion, you can use hole punches, you can gouge and tear the film, you can use colored magic markers, you can, you know, I use ink and stuff like that. With if you're coloring a reversal print, you can use anything that will adhere to the emulsion. Usually, you know, watercolor paint, oil paint, as long as you let it dry entirely. You know, fine magic markers, you know, those kind of industrial design, water-based magic markers that hold, any of those things will hold pigment can be transferred to video. If you're working in film, it has to be something, because it's going to be run through a chemical bath, it has to be something that's impervious to the chemical bath. So in order to change, generally what was done when 35 millimeter material was hand colored for projection, each print was hand colored, which is an insane, obviously, insane amount of work to do it.
What if you wanted that like, bad Ted Turner colorization of like black and white? Like if you wanted to use that as an aesthetic?
Computer program. There's a computer program that identifies. I mean, I don't know it's like, you guys know the movie called Waking Life by... Yeah, so I mean, Waking Life used a kind of computer program that basically took the digital footage and did a kind of it's a rotoscope program that takes the outline of the character and allows you to fill in. There's a related program that will allow you to colorize footage. And I've never used it. I think you probably map out, you probably put the cursor into certain points. You hit the point in any place that has a tonal range. You say, overlay flesh, overlay blue, overlay green. It's interesting, actually, because you're touching on, I thought for a little while when colorization first sort of came in, and it was so kind of shockingly awful. I thought, like, this is kind of an untapped possibility.
Yeah.
But I never really pursued it. I'm sure there's a software program that would allow you to do it.
You can do like DS. There's also compositing. There's a lot of like post production.
So like the Avid has something.
No.
After Effects generally. Well, you know, the main. If you use, most people these days are using Final Cut Pro in association with After Effects.
Yeah.
And After Effects has, I mean, there's so many. I haven't used any of this stuff. There's like Jitter. I mean, there's like a million software plugins now. I'm old school. I do the animation I did last night. I drew all those fucking drawings because I'm insane.
I think that's like a personality.
You know, you could do that by a computer. I was like, I know, but it wouldn't look the same. It doesn't actually look the same. But technologically, in terms of post production, sky's the limit now. If you learn After Effects, it's remarkable what can be done. There's also, there's rotoscoping that can be done. There's a tool called a Flame, which is a post production tool, which is scary tool. Basically, all of the, any commercial you see where like the actress looks suspiciously perfect, you're like, how come there's no skin tone? It's because the Flame has been used. It's a tool that you can use. Literally, I've used it only a couple times. I mean, it's mad. On big Hollywood movies. Yeah, the Flame is like $350 an hour. Wow. And it's, like when you see, any like giant Nicole Kidman movie, when Nicole Kidman looks like scarily perfect, she's been flamed to death. I mean, actors now on movies that are $25 million or more that need cosmetic, attractive stuff. And it's like an industry secret, but not much of a secret. Everybody's run through the flame. They've got, it's paint hair in.
Like Sex in the City, Sarah Jessica Parker, the only thing that is on her is her face.
You got it.
That's it.
You got it.
Like
No, they're also actors. It's like, trade secrets. It's like Lisa Kudrow has very deep set eyes. She's incredibly difficult to light. So no matter how much light you pump in, she's always got like a kind of funny thing underneath, and it's like part of the contract of the actor. Things that they get you, I must be vague. It's like,
what labs do you process at?
What lab?
Yeah.
For black and white 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter, I use a lab in Seattle called Alpha Cine. I'm extremely loyal to them because they did an incredible job with Swoon and took me on early in my career when the New York labs weren't so interested. There are labs in New York that I use. Technicolor, DuArt is another really well-known lab. DuArt is sort of a famous student lab. I didn't go to DuArt for Swoon because they didn't do black and white processing so often. So for my Super 8 material, I tend to process my Super 8 material inexpensively at this place called Pack Lab, but I transfer it very expensively because I'm not bothered in my Super 8 work to have scratches or gouges or problems with the image, but what I want is a very immaculate transfer, so it's worth it to me to have a transfer.
Have you, using a lab in Seattle, had shipping issues? Like,
It's part of the budget. So like when we did Swoon, part of the budget was the weekly run of FedEx back and forth, and then Swoon premiered at Sundance, and we were so cutting up against the wire. I'm pretty much have always been the editor of my work. I trained first as an editor before I worked as a producer or a writer or a director. So when Swoon was being completed, we had all of these archival slugs. In a film print, everything mechanically, physically has to be cut into the print. So I had to fly to Seattle right before Sundance and sit with the negative cutter, cutting the archival footage in and out because we were so rushed for time. It was like, I was literally one of the ones like carrying my wet print from the laboratory to Sundance to show it. I'd never seen the print projected, and when we saw it projected the first time, because we blew up from 16 to 35 millimeter, it amplified the grain and made it really contrasty. And Ellen Kuras and Ellen has gone on to shoot a lot of movies, like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and dozens of movies. She's quite prominent. Swoon was her first feature. Neither of us had ever blown up a movie to 35 millimeter, so we're in our big premiere screening. The lights come down, it goes up, and we're like, oh my God, the grain is the size of marbles. We're just like, it's hideous. We hate the way it looks because we were used to how it looked in video, which is very silvery and very beautiful. Well, Ellen won the cinematography prize for Swoon. And we were smart enough at the moment when the film won. We're like, how did you get that incredibly contrasty look? We're like, oh, of course we intended it from the very beginning. It was like completely a lie. And so it's a really, and the Jeffrey Bean movie that I did after Swoon, which is a very peculiar film in my career. I've never done a kind of commissioned fashion film. I used exactly the same technology. I shot in 16 millimeter and blew up at 35 millimeter because of this kind of grainy contrast, because of the kind of look that it yielded.
Has FedEx ever
Can we move on?
Can we see this?
Yeah, let's continue. And then we can just circle back to questions. Boom, boom, here I am. This is, we're sort of 20 minutes into the film, and this is the kidnap and murder scene of the film.
Go ahead, get the front seat. Hello, Bobby.
Note this moment. I'll come back. I'll refer to this. The transition right there.
Treated. Now I know you, and you shall come to know me.
You turn the light back on. So that's the sequence I was talking about that's structurally built right on top of the shower scene of Psycho. From the cut point that I talk moving forward corresponds with gently getting in the shower, turning on, and a shot length, cut length. Each one, shot by shot, cut by cut, carries that. This is really connected actually to my roots and the idea of scratch video, actually the way I was trained, which is the notion of working with appropriated video. One of the ways I learned to cut as an editor initially is I would take 30-second television commercials, lay them down, and then edit on top of them, shot length, and taking apart the musical and rhythmic structures of a 30-second television commercial. Okay, it's a 1 second shot, 1 second shot, 4 second shot, 2 second shot, and this rhythmic analysis and structural analysis embedded in those structural rhythms is meaning, is story actually. It's a real kind of turning point and understanding in terms of the way that I work. This technique, I think, is very, very useful in terms of cutting generally. Many editors talk about the idea of using music. So often, music is laid underneath a scene to create a tempo or a rhythm structure of cutting, and then that music is removed from the scene. And what stays in the scene is an unconscious trace of the musical rhythm. I use this entirely in my cutting. It's basically my entire cutting style is based on this way of working, which is a kind of rhythmic music scene. And so I often think in a scene, what is the musical idiom that I'm expressing in the scene? So if I have a slow, fluid, romantic seduction scene, I put a waltz down. And I'm cutting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm. And I'm trying to land on those cuts. If I'm having a very percussive, angry confrontation scene, I might use a rumba or a tango or something. I'm using kind of the musical structures underneath. I found this a very interesting thing of how there is actually meaning in the architecture of the cutting structure that the audience is able to take away from the film. It's a really powerful kind of element in cinematic storytelling. The other thing to say in this film is that you can see in the scene that I just showed you is the kidnap and up to the moment the car drives away was shot 10 months before, and then when the car starts driving towards you, that's 10 months later. In other words, the kidnap and the murder are shot 10 months apart. What happened is when I first shot the film, I was so terrified of the material. I mean, I'm a nice Catholic boy that, it's like interested in this horrible sordid crime material, but I didn't really want to shoot the murder. So I had this kind of, I went to art school and I thought I was going to do this really kind of off-kilter, interesting idea of shooting the murder in a studio. And so I had the actors like in a black studio, like swinging the chisel and the kids' legs kicking. And, I cut the material and it was just laughably ludicrous. It was like a kid in front of black paper kicking his legs. It was just silly. And I really had a kind of turning point when I cut together the material that I shot for those first 10 days because I realized if you're going to tell a story from the point of view of these two characters, and the cathartic turning point of the story is this murder, and the audience has to suddenly shift in their relationship to the characters because they have to be, the wind has to be knocked out of your gut as you realize, oh my God, he's got blood on his face and he's laughing. I was like, I can't hide from the scene. So we went back and shot the scene. It was a really kind of powerful turning point of realizing you can't hide. In dramaturgy, there is an expression called the obligatory scene. And the notion of the obligatory scene in dramaturgy is that story expectations lead an audience to believe that a scene will happen, usually climactic or as a turning point, because the seeds of that thing have been set before. So in a romantic comedy where two characters meet in a laundromat and they both hate each other, you know the obligatory scene is they're going to kiss later. And the audience unconsciously waits for the obligatory scene. So in a film like Swoon, one of my obligatory scenes is the murder scene. And how one renders an obligatory scene, I think, is critical in terms of your quality as a filmmaker. The way you render an obligatory scene, it's an opportunity to push past cliche. It's an opportunity to show something the audience knows that it needs to see or knows that's going to come, but doesn't quite know what shape it's going to come in. I mean, I've learned a lot about about thinking about turning points in films, about what is an obligatory scene. I think that's a key thing in dramatic narrative structure when you're working in a feature-length film, is to think about the turning points or climactic scenes and to identify those notion of the obligatory scene and take them apart and look at them. I think it's one of the, also as the opposite way, if you're a film scholar and you want to look and take apart a filmmaker's working, all you really need to do with a really powerful filmmaker is look at the way they render their obligatory scenes. Really good directors tend to render an obligatory scene in a very opinionated way. They don't, in other words, in a romantic comedy where the couple has to kiss, they show you kissing, the characters kissing in a way that's like remarkable and you've never seen it before. The obligatory scene that's done in a way that corresponds to exactly what you expect is the movie that you say, okay, I know already. I'm bored. Obligatory scenes are an opportunity to keep the audience with you in the present tense. They're really a critical part of the medium. It's a kind of idea of the moment of the scene happening now, happening then. The other thing that has to be very interesting about it is just all of what I learned about like working with kids. You know, this was like a 12-year-old actor in the film who had to play the murder victim, and I was so completely freaked out about doing this thing, and you know, wanting not the, you know, like worried that the mother was going to think that I was like some creepy gay guy that like had something for their kid. So like, you know, I have to ask the parents to allow me to photograph the child's legs from the knee down naked. And I can't just get on, at this stage of my career, I can't pick up the phone and say, hi, Sherry, I need to photograph, you know, John's legs from the knee down naked. I like dance around it in the most like ridiculous way. Finally she's like, Tom, what do you need? I was like, I have to do a shot of his legs. Okay, I'll send him to set in a bathing suit. So, you know, really cautious with the kid. I'm like, okay. We do the first take. He's like, that was so much fun. You can do it with more blood next time. And I was like, oh, okay. It's a 12-year-old kid, of course. And one of the sort of most interesting things in my professional life is encountering that young kid as a young actor, 21. Many years later, and him describing back to me the shooting of a scene and saying, you know, you were incredible, you took such good care of me. I didn't really understand the full context of what the film was about. When I saw it later, I was so struck by like sort of what good work we all did together on the film. And that was a really powerful thing of realizing. And it's also really changed my own consciousness of, I could think back to myself at 12 and 13. I don't know about the rest of you, but I was fairly conscious at that age and was not quite an adult, but not, you know, I didn't need to have people speak down to me. Really changed the way I ended up working. So in Savage Grace, I had to work again with a young actor, actor Barney Clark, who plays the son of Julianne Moore and Stephen Delane. And it was really useful material in terms of directing that kid and figuring out how to speak to him. And there's a scene in Savage Grace, which I'm not going to show today, where the young boy takes a bath and the parents come in after a long night out, and the suggestion in the scene is really kind of complicated. It's implied that this 13-year-old boy might have slept with another boy, and it's also clear that the boy in the bathtub is sort of very aware of the Oedipal tensions in the relationship. And we did one take of the scene, and then Julianne Moore and Steve Delane grabbed me by the elbow, pulled me off set, and were like, what did you say to that child? And it was like, nothing. I'm telling you, I didn't say, and they were like, you must have said something, because, you know, it was so palpable, the subtext of the scene. And, you know, all we talk about, what I observed of this child actor was his father was the guardian on set, and he had an incredibly fraught relationship with his father and totally resented him. So the day we were shooting the scene, I went in and I said, hi Barney, I just want to check in about the scene we're going to shoot today to make sure you're clear about what the scene is about. And he looked at me completely with no, like, just poker face, and he's like, yeah, I basically want to kill my dad, right? I was like, I said, well, not exactly, but that's the right feeling, actually. You're very angry at your father, and you're using this as a way to prove that you're closer to your mother than your father. That's all that needed to be said. That was the direction for the kid. And that was a kind of really incredible turning point about the idea of the consciousness of that 13-year-old kid. I didn't impose something onto him. He knew and understood what he was doing, and also chose to be in the film, wanted to be in the film, wanted to be a participant in the film. Interestingly, you know, I would talk to his parents, and I was like, I'm not super comfortable with him reading the entire script unless you guys are, and they're like, no, it's not necessary. But he really wanted to know before he wrapped. He's like, what does my character do when he grows up? I kill someone, don't I? And I just was, I'm so stirring to me. I was like, you know, I had to go to, like, call the mother. I was like, can I tell him what happened later in the story? She's like, of course you can tell him. I was like, yes, you killed your mother later in the story. And so I just thought it was really kind of a powerful thing to realize how conscious kids are at that age and how much they bring. So I want to show one last scene of Swoon. This is, I'm going to have to, unfortunately, because the
see how some of the letters are punched so hard? Soon.
Okay, so now it's very much later in the film. They've eluded capture for quite a long time. They've eluded capture for quite a period of time, and they finally are found and brought in because Nathan Leopold's glasses, which he drops at the scene of the crime, have a very rare patented hinge on the side of his lens. On that note, it's 90 minutes in. I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to take a little break and come back and pick up after.